in the first place. Maybe there's a situation where grief has taken place and widowhood has become the necessity. But either way, I just want to encourage any women out there who are listening to continue to raise your children in the Christian faith. Continue to raise your children, to catechize them, teach them the Bible, pray with them, even if dad isn't in the picture or on the scene anymore.
Amen. And I'm glad you said that, because I want you to go into a little bit more detail about women and their obedience. You know, what significance, if any, is there of Lydia's gender in this story in Acts? You know, how might this account empower women in particular to be obedient as a servant to Christ? Now, you touched up on them being single and raising their child up in the right spiritual way, but how can this particular action of obedience, you know, put a woman in a very unique situation as a servant of Christ?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate you asking that. I think when I look out at the state of Christianity today, of course, the ideal situation would be that perfect picture of the family where mom and dad are holding hands and they've got their Bibles in their hands, they're going into church, children are following after. They come early for Sunday school, stay through worship, and everything is just right. They do table devotions like a family, and dad leads in prayer and all that kind of stuff. And that's the ideal. And of course, we want to strive to that, where husbands and fathers would be the spiritual leaders of their homes. But the reality is, and this is a sad reality, Brandon, that far too often men have failed in their roles and obligations to lead their family in the Lord.
Absolutely.
And far too much, I know I see it in my church, and you probably do too, that there are, every church I've been a part of, I've seen this, where you have a mother who apparently has become the spiritual leader of the household because the father is simply unwilling or incapable or perhaps even unconverted and has no desire to lead his family. And in those kind of situations, then the mother has no choice but to step up and to take that lead as the spiritual mentor to her children. And so we can be encouraged here, whether we're male or female, that we have this example of Lydia, who is faithful. And honestly, the guys can look to the Philippian jailer in the next story right after this one. Either way, parents concerned for the spiritual well-being of their family, bringing their children to the waters of baptism, and openly declaring that this household is a household that will follow the Lord.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful, stitched quilt, if you will. And you talked about it earlier, that Lydia's entire household was baptized. Why do you believe that her whole household was baptized following her baptism? Why was that so significant for her?
Right. Well, it's significant because of the Bible's theology of the covenant. In the scriptures, you have to understand, we interpret the Bible, at least as Presbyterians, covenantally, which means that we see God dealing with his people not only as individuals, but also as communities. So in contradiction to some other versions of Christianity who see the faith primarily as an individual experience of God or a personal experience of God, we Presbyterians, we emphasize both the personal aspect of our relationship with God, but also the corporate aspect of our relationship with God. And so, I like to tell people this way. I have a personal relationship with Jesus, but I also have a personal corporate relationship with Jesus, which means that my family is just as much a part of my faith as is my own individual relationship to the Lord. And not only that, but we can expand that to the corporate community of the church. And so it's not just me and JC, it's me and my spouse and my children and my church pursuing the Lord together. And that's why God has, throughout redemption history, given these signs and seals of the righteousness that is had by faith. I'm quoting from Romans 4 right there. The signs and seals of the righteousness that we have by faith. And in the Old Covenant, that sign and seal to be placed on believing families was the sign of circumcision. which of course, as we know, is the removal of the skin of the foreskin, a sign that was placed primarily on, well, exclusively on men by definition, of course. But that sign was to be placed on one's children just nearly as soon as they were born, on the 8th day. So they were to immediately be marked as part of the believing community of faith. Well, in the Old Testament, that sign of circumcision, I'm getting a little theological here, Brandon.
That's fine.
That Old Testament sign of circumcision was a painful, bloody sign. It hurt and it bled. And the point of that was to point forward to the Messiah, who would go through pain and bleed for the sake of his people. And so even in the sign and seal of circumcision, you have this foreshadowing of the death of Jesus Christ, that he would come and bleed and endure suffering for the sake of his people. Now that Messiah has come and has died for us and been raised, we have another sign, a gracious sign of the covenant, and that sign is baptism. So if circumcision pointed forward to the death of Christ, baptism points backwards to the redemption that Christ's death brings. And so this sign, likewise, is to be placed on the family of believers. And so Lydia does what is right here and immediately has her household baptized, indicating that she has every intention not only to believe herself, but to raise her children and her family in the faith.
That's awesome. That brings me back to my grandmother. You know, she longed for all of her grandkids to know God, to know who Christ was. And, you know, raising 11 to 13 grandkids at one particular time in her life, she somehow found a way to get us to church. And this was such an unfortunate scene that we dealt with. And I don't recall going back to that church as a child because of it, although my sisters and all went back after quite some time. And then that's how I became Presbyterian, if you will, because another church kind of picked up that role. And again, it was a covenant. It was more like, we're going to help you. We're going to come alongside my grandmother and help her raise these children in a godly manner so they would never depart from it. And I'm like forever grateful that, you know, the women, when I was a kid, the women that stepped up and did that, I'm going to name one of them. Her name's Betsy McGee. I call her my second mom, if you will, or one of my second moms. And she, from the age of 5, has been in my life up until now. And I mean, still actively today. And this is a joke, telling me how to live my life. But at the same time, I'm forever grateful for that, because she's given me this sense of, you're important to God, and you need to be in communion with God. And I'm going to come alongside you and help you with that. I'm going to make that covenant to help you with that. And it's such a beautiful thing. And you know, Matt, reading this entire chapter, one sentence, and it's only a couple words, stood out the most with this entire chapter. And this is, I'm going to close with this. Ordinary Christians do matter. Okay. And by reading that, I just started thinking, okay, so Matt is this famous Presbyterian preacher. You know, he's like next to R.C. Sproul. Okay, he's like
that is false. We're gonna have to cut this from the tape, man.
Okay, I'm joking, but no, like seriously, Matt, you're a great preacher. But let's be honest, who was behind you the most growing up when you started?
My wife.
Your wife, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your wife is behind you till this day, and you have an awesome wife. I love Kelly. She is an amazing woman.
Yeah.
She has been behind you since day one. Okay. Now let's go a little bit further. Who was behind you when you were a child growing up?
Yeah, actually, I know where you're going with this. It was my mom. And while I had both a good mom and a good dad, I'm very thankful for that. You know, my dad did a lot of wonderful things. Taught me how to throw and to hit the baseball and sports and things like that. And, you know, helped in so many ways with great practical advice. But it was my mom who took me to church and brought me to my first communion class and saw that I was baptized and confirmed in the church. And so I'll always be thankful for her for that role that she led in my faith at an early age.
Yeah. So what I'm getting at, and I have 6 sisters, and I find myself having to be encouragement to them. And look, I am not sitting here complaining about being that encouragement, because I do feel, me as a man, because I'm a man now, I'm no longer a little boy like they think I am, me having the opportunity to give them that encouragement and to be there for them spiritually is by far one of the greatest gifts that I've ever had. Right before my grandmother passed, now she never, from what I can remember or from what I've seen, she never wavered in her faith. And the one thing she taught me on her deathbed is yes and amen. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, or like when she got really, really sick, it was so be it. Okay. So be it. She lived a good life. She raised her kids, and God blessed her and gave her the opportunity to raise her grandkids. By that, she taught me how to trust God, and I'm not taking a stab at men here, because that would just be wrong. But we find that women grab hold of the gospel sometimes more than men do. And this is just my call out for the men. If you're listening to this podcast, you're not a bad person. Okay. We're all sinners, but let's be more intentional with our faith. Let's come alongside our working women, if you will, and just be that support, and also be that force that helps not only push the gospel forward, but push your family into more of a united Christian household. And it doesn't mean the mom does all the Christian-y stuff and the dad does all the manly stuff. No, you come together as one and you both do it. And that leads us, this is the end of this podcast, but that leads us to a preview of next week when we talk about Priscilla and Aquila and their role in the church. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining me again. Your book is teaching me a lot, and so far we've had 2 winners win the book. One was Hank Williams out of Houma, Louisiana, and the other one was a Robert out of Georgia or Alabama, I believe. So you
great. Well, congratulations to those listeners, and glad to be able to give away a couple of copies.
I have 3 more books left to give away. And to top it all off, I am going to also throw in an extra copy of With Her Last Breath from from 2 seasons ago, in junction with your book Unknown. So we are asking our listeners to submit questions to us. And at the very last episode, Matt and I are going to figure out how we're going to do it, but we're going to answer all of your questions that you send to us. So please send us a question, a voice message, and you will have a chance to win a copy of Unknown and a copy of With Her Last Breath. So I want to throw that in there.
Wow, awesome. That sounds great.
So,
very cool.
All right, Matt. Well, it was great talking to you, and I'll talk to you next week.
You too. Thanks, Brandon. See you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? You see, when I was trying to get my podcast off the ground, I had a lot of questions. I mean, a lot of questions. Questions like, how do I record an episode? Or how do I get my show into all the apps that people use to listen to podcasts? How do I make money from my podcast? The answer to every one of these questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing your podcast. Best of all, it is completely 100% free and super easy to use. And now Anchor can match you with great sponsors who want to advertise on your podcast. That means you can get paid to podcast right away. In fact, that is exactly what I'm doing right now by reading this ad. So if you always wanted to start a podcast and make money doing it, go to Anchor. Go to anchor.fm/start and join me in a diverse community of podcasters already using Anchor. That's anchor.fm/start. I cannot wait to hear your podcast.
Greetings. This is Steve Salyards, the author of the GA Junkie, and here are some Presbyterian history notes for the week of January 5th. Sunday, January 5th. Robert Morrison was born on this day in 1782 in England. The son of Scottish parents, he grew up and was ordained by the Presbyterian Church in England and pastored there for a few years. before the London Missionary Society sent him to China in 1807. He was the first Protestant missionary in China, and worked for the British East India Company